Hi everyone, it's Megan, and it is currently the very end of January, which means that Valentine's Day is right around the corner, and I do not have a Valentine's Day quilt. So I need to come up with something lickety-split, because I want a Valentine's Day quilt. And there are a few requirements that I'm looking at. It's got to be fast because we are on a time crunch. It's got to be easy because I don't want to spend a lot of time working on a holiday quilt that's only out for a couple of weeks in the year. And it's got to use up some of these fat quarters behind me. So I have come up with this super easy pattern. So let's get to it. I'm going to pull my fat quarters and let's get to cutting. All right, let's jump in and make our quilt. This is what you'll need to get started. I have chosen 8 fat quarters of kind of reds and pinks that I liked. I've also chosen 8 fat quarters of low volume fabrics. Now I have chosen ones that have kind of a red or pink in the kind of accent color for the low volume, but you can choose whatever low volumes you would like. This would be really cute with a text print fabric or just solids like yardage if you don't have a lot of low volumes. You can get the downloadable PDF pattern from my website. The link will be in the description. And this will just have the fabric requirements and some basic instructions for you if you are making this quilt after you've seen this video. You'll also need a rotary cutter and some rotary cutting rulers. I have kind of my favorite rectangular rulers. And then we will also be squaring up these blocks when we're done. And I have a 16.5-inch square ruler, but this is nice to have. It is not required. You can certainly square these blocks up with one of your rectangular rulers and your cutting mat. So this is a nice to have, not required. Now we will be making several cuts for this block on the bias, and that will introduce a little bit of stretch in the seams when we go to sew the pieces together. And because of that, I am going to lightly starch these fat quarters as I press them. They've been folded up on boards for quite a while and probably have some pretty deep creases in them. So I'm going to press them and starch them, and then we'll get going. I have pressed and cut all of our blocks to 18 inches, and now we are going to pair them. So you're going to choose one red block and one white block that will eventually create 2 inverse colored hearts. So one will have a white heart on a red background, and the other will have a red heart on a white background. So choose 2 fabrics that you like together because they are going to be in your quilt twice together. So I'm going to sort these real fast, and then we'll get started on cutting the first block. All right, I have paired up all of my packets of fabrics into a red and a white, and they're all set off to the side. And I'm going to work with these 2 fabrics first. Now, I do want to take note that if you have a directional fabric, you should be looking at it right now the way you want it to look in the quilt. So this will be the bottom of the block, this will be the top of the block, and it will be oriented this way with the heart kind of in the center here. We have our 18-inch block. We are going to cut it in half to make 2 9 by 18-inch rectangles. And I'm just going to divide it from top to bottom right in half. So now we are going to fold these together right sides together. And this is just like when you were in kindergarten and you made one of those hearts by folding a piece of paper in half and drawing a hook shape and then opening it back up. We're doing the same thing here. So you're going to fold your fabric together and align the edges. And now it's time to make our cuts for the heart. There are going to be 3 cuts that we make. The first cut will form the kind of inner point of the heart. So we're going to be cutting from the center up to the top. And however kind of shallow or deep your angle is will change the way that your heart looks. If you have a very kind of shallow angle here, your heart will have a very kind of narrow, pointy top. And if you, in contrast, do it really far out, then your heart is going to have a very flat top. So there's no wrong or right way to do this. All of your hearts will be cut individually and they're not going to be measured. So they're all going to be a little bit wonky. And that's kind of the fun of this quilt. It's fast and easy and there's no measuring, but that does kind of create this wonky jumbled look. So I like to have my hearts somewhere around 5 or 6 inches down. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, somewhere in this area. And I like to have my ruler kind of land on kind of like the outer half or third. So I'm not going to overthink it. I'm just going to put my ruler right here and make a slice. And then I'm going to move that triangle away. Now we're going to cut the bottom angle of our heart. And it's the same thing here. If you cut a very high angle, then your heart is going to be narrow and sharp. If you cut a kind of an angle that's closer to horizontal, then your heart is going to be very kind of rounded, not rounded on the bottom, but a little bit kind of fatter on the bottom. So there's no right or wrong way to do this. The only thing I want you to keep in mind is to not cut like the bottom 2 inches of this fabric, because we will be trimming these blocks down at a later step, and I don't want you to have to cut off the point of your heart. So let's just say like the bottom 2 inches of this, 1.5 inches, 2 inches is out of bounds. So don't let your ruler slip to the very corner, because then you're going to end up with a flat bottom heart. So I'm not going to think too much about this. Just go right here. And then we move that slice out of the way. And now the last cut is going to go this way. And this is going to create this outer line of the heart. So if you definitely want to have an angle to it. So just pick something that looks good to you. And there is our heart. So now we are going to open this little booklet of fabric up and take a look. So when we open it up, we are going to have all of the white fabric on top. And all we need to do is just swap the 2 heart pieces to create our 2 blocks. So put the white piece on the bottom and the red piece on top. And the same here. So there, you can see our little heart starting to come together. From here, we will cut the rest of our blocks, and then we will chain piece all of our blocks at the same time. So I'm going to be chain piecing these, and if you take a look at the pattern, you'll see that there's a sew first on this line, and that line is the line between the heart and this last cut that we made. So this seam on both sides will be sewn first, and then we will attach the first 2 cuts that we made. Okay, I'm ready to begin chain piecing the heart shape to the outer corner. And I just wanted to point out before I jump in that you need to offset these seams just a little bit to help the blocks or the seams to line up for the next step. Now, they're not going to come out perfectly because we're joining 2 pieces of fabric that don't have seam allowance built into them. Just do your best and offset it so that about 1/4 inch in is where your fabrics are meeting. And you'll see that that creates a little triangle of red and a little overhang of white down here, or opposite if you're working on a white heart with a red background. So chain piece all of your hearts to your outer corners on one side, and then do the chain piecing of the other side of the block. And then we're going to press to the background, and then we'll come back and assemble the last few pieces onto our block. Okay, I have my inner hearts attached to the corners on both sides, and now we can attach the kind of other two pieces, the first two cuts that we made, to this center panel. And it doesn't matter which one you do first. I'm going to do these little pieces first. So I'm going to take the center and this. Now, this is where the seam allowances are going to start to give us a little bit of trouble, because I can't make it even on both sides. Like, no matter where I place this triangle, it's going to be shorter on both edges than the center line and the top of the block. So what we need to do is decide which seam we want to keep straight. Now, this is the center of the block, and we will be sewing this to the other half of the block. So let's align this outer triangle so that this edge stays straight when we press it open. And to do that, we want to have this V 1/4 of an inch in from the cut edge. So this V should be at our stitch line. And out here, we're not really going to worry about it. We're going to end up with a piece that when we press it open is not aligned across the top of the block. And that's why we're going to trim this block down in a later step. So the focus is keeping the center line, the center seam line, as even as possible. And it depends on how deep or shallow your original cuts were as to how big this triangle will need to be. So we've stitched starting at that little V in our overlapped fabrics, and now when we press it open, that forms a nice straight line to make our center seam of our block easier to sew. So I'm going to chain all of the small triangles to the center panel, and then I'm going to add this outer triangle here, and I'm going to align it the same way. Okay, see how my stitch line meets that little notch in my overlapped fabric? That's going to give me that nice straight seam line along the middle of the block. And out here, you can see that this triangle is much larger than the piece that we just attached it to, because we lost 1/2 inch of fabric when we sewed these two pieces together. So there's 1/2 inch of fabric on the back that was eaten up by the seam allowance that makes this piece shorter than this piece. So that's why we're going to trim this block down. So don't worry too much about it. I'm going to chain piece the small triangles and the large triangles to one side, press them, and then do the other half of the block. We are finished with all 16 blocks. I have them all piled up here, and you can see how the effect of not having seam allowances built into our pieces has really caused the outside edges of our blocks to be quite wonky. None of these are in a straight line, and trying to sew them together in this state would be really difficult. It would be kind of a mess. So we are going to trim them down all to the same size. Now, my blocks, I'm going to trim down to 16 inches square, and that means that the finished block size will be 15.5 inches. If your seam allowances were a little bit bigger than mine, go ahead and trim it down to a consistent block size that is as big as you can make it. And for you, that might be trimming them all down to 15 inches. It's just all going to depend on how consistent your seam allowances were and kind of where you had the unevenness land. So I'm going to do 16 inches. So I'm just lining the edge of the fabric up with that 16-inch line so that I can cut off the excess. And that's that. That is our first 16-inch block. Now, as I trim these, I'm going to separate them into two piles. I'm going to have a white heart on a dark background or a red background, and then I'm going to make a separate pile of red hearts on white backgrounds. And that's just so when I go to put my rows together, I have kind of easy access. So I have 8 squares here that are white background with red hearts, and then I have 8 that are red backgrounds with white hearts. And now we need to arrange them into 4 rows of 4 blocks. And to do that, I am going to use my little cheater method to arrange blocks. And I am going to fold these into quarters, which is just big enough that I can get an idea of the fabrics involved, but not so big that I can't fit the whole thing on my table. And as I fold these, I'm just going to kind of put them in a spot. And this won't be their final area, their final landing area, but it will give me a place to start working from. I am going to alternate the rows here. So this first row will start with a red heart on a white, and below will be a white heart on a red. So I'm just going to fold these up and get them all to kind of where I think they might like to be. I think I'm pretty happy with that. I don't see any kind of glaring problem areas. So I'm going to stack these up and get them ready to sew. And now to do that, I take one row and I stack it from the first block I'll sew over. And this is row 4. So I'm going to stick 4 pins into this upper left corner. And that will just help keep me organized. And then I'll do the same thing for this third row. All right, we're ready to sew our rows. I'll be pressing all of those seam allowances open as I go. So I'm gonna grab these stacks and go over to my sewing machine. We're ready to sew, and I have stack number 1 in front of me because it has 1 pin. And I'm gonna take the first block in that pile and put it on my sewing machine. And then I'm going to take the second block in that pile and put it right sides together with that block. If you need to open it up to make sure your hearts are both going in the right direction, and also that you have a white background and then a white heart next to each other, then definitely go ahead and do that. So once you're happy with that, then we are going to sew this edge together. And if you want to pin, you certainly can. I'm just going to go for it because these are both straight grain cuts, so there's not a lot of stretch here. So I'm just going to wing it. Okay, now we can open this up and we are ready for the third block here, which is the next block in the stack. Let's open it up, make sure it's right side up, and then we put it right sides together with our block number 2. now we're ready for the last heart. So let's open it up. Make sure the heart is right side up, right sides together, and sew. And there's our first row all put together. Now I am going to leave this one pin in the upper left corner so that I know that this is the first row of my quilt. But I'm going to go ahead and press these seams open right now, and then I will repeat this process with the 3 other rows of this quilt. We are ready to assemble our rows, and I still have the pins in the upper left corner that denote each of my rows. So there's 1 pin for the first row, 2 pins for the second row, and so on. And that's just going to help me make sure that I get these rows sewn together in the right order. So the first step is sewing row 1 to row 2. So I'm just going to set aside row 3 and row 4 for right now and get those out of our way. So you're going to need some pins and to lay row 1 out in front of you. Okay, now row 2 is going to be arranged. You want the top of row 2 to be sewn to the bottom of row 1. So we're going to make sure that we have that arranged right and then put them right sides together. And you're going to want to make sure to pin along this edge. And I kind of usually start in the middle and pin out to the sides. And just make sure you start where 2 blocks come together. See, I have the pink background and the white background, and the white background and the pink background. And I want to make sure these seams line up as well as they can. I'll put a pin there. Now, I really recommend pinning long seams like this. I don't always pin short seams, but long seams, even a little bit of a tension issue with your presser foot can really add up over the length of a long seam. And so I try to pin at least at the intersections I really care about, like where blocks come together at the corners. And then I use, here's the 2 pins from the top left of the second row. And I'm going to pull them out now and just kind of use those to pin. And I'm going to pin right here. And then this, I want the centers of my blocks to also line up. So I'm pinning at the centers and then at the intersections. I really like making holiday quilts like this. I feel like they're a lot of fun to have out and decorate with, and they're kind of, I don't know, lower pressure than a normal quilt because they're only out for a certain amount of time. And they can be really fun to experiment with. And you get to pack them away, which makes more room for other quilts. And it's kind of nice to take them out just once a year and cuddle with them and have your couple weeks with the quilt and then pack it away, and it's like a surprise for next year. So I have this seam all pinned along the length, and now I'm going to sew it together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Rows 1 and 2 are together, and now I'm going to repeat the same process with row 3 and row 4. So we're going to have 2 halves of our quilt, row 1 and 2, and then 3 and 4. And I also went ahead and pressed this long seam open. Here's our finished quilt top. This quilt ended up taking me about 3.5 hours according to my timer, which I'm not going to claim was like completely perfect, but I think that's really fast for kind of an instant gratification quilt when you need one at the very last minute for a holiday or for a gift. You can also make this quilt with layer cake squares. We cut our squares to 18 inches, but if you start with the 10-inch square, you'll just have to trim your blocks much smaller, and you'll have to make a lot more of them to make a sizable quilt. And you can also change the layout of this quilt. I've gone with 4x4 because I really love a square quilt, but if you want to do 3x4 for a 12 block quilt, then you will need to just adjust your beginning fat quarters. Each set of 2 fat quarters makes 2 blocks. So just keep that in mind when you're deciding on your layout. You definitely want an even number of blocks, or you can use the extra if you have an odd number of blocks. For, like, if you want to make a 9 block quilt, you can use the extra for a pillow. Now obviously this is not quilted yet. That will be kind of my next task. I'm going to put it on the frame and do just a fun, quick, all over pattern to get this quilt done. And then I need to decide on a binding, which I think is probably going to be some stripes, because a stripy binding is just the best. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. The PDF download with the fabric requirements and kind of the general instructions for this is available on my website for free, and the link is in the description below. I'll be back next Monday with a brand new tutorial, and I hope you join me then. Happy quilting!